Hello and welcome to your tarot class. We're going to start at the beginning with history. But first, I'm going to explain. I'm a firm believer, since I'm formally educated and I come from a family that's formally educated, that when you want to learn something true and deep, you have to build a sound foundation, which is why I believe that starting with some history is paramount. And then building upon recognizing, the macro view of everything before we go into the micro view of everything. So let me first explain. We live in a world where, modern technology is amazing and everything is at your fingertips. But we're also living in a world that's, highly confused, and more people are just staying uneducated. And when you look at fancy blogs and you look at, websites and videos online, it's very easy for the person that knows nothing about something. If someone has a really good way of presenting information, they can seem like they'll sell you on the idea and they seem like this expert. Well, I'm a firm believer that if you're going to go back into the history of something, especially something like cartomancy, which takes art and craftsmanship and a bunch of interesting interwoven eras, that you have to start at the source. And there's no one better equipped on this planet than properly, formally educated anthropologists, some sociologists, and definitely historians. Those are the social scientists that specialize in looking back in certain parts of history and piecing it together properly according to standards. And when you look at decks and artwork and everything like that, you want to look to universities that have private collections. They have historical departments that, mention this kind of thing, this kind of work. And you want to go into, museums, places that have medieval and Renaissance, artwork and relics and records and artifacts and so forth. And this is where you go to the source, not cute little blogs and little TikTok videos and little online videos that look really, really spiffy, and they are completely false. Okay, so do your own research. But this is my class and I want to start with a good foundation. Now that I've explained some of my teaching style, let's dive in. We're going to go first to a time period, 3000 BC in Egypt. This is where papyrus was first created. Very important, because this will lead to something way later. And papyrus was the first form of paper. Although not really paper itself, but it's the closest thing to actual paper. The process is different, but things were painted on it and scrolled and documented. After 3000 BC, ancient Egypt, we're going to travel a little bit after. And that lands us in 105 AD in China, where Kai Lun invented paper. Now we're going to leave 105 AD. We're going to go all the way to 1215. First paper mills were created in Italy. Now, I'm going to stop the timeline for a moment, and I'm going to explain something kind of in a nutshell. Then I'm going to go back and continue the timeline where I left off. So, in the nutshell version, when anything is happening, think of modern day. When anything is happening at the, aristocratic level, the celebrities, the rich, right? And there's trends and stuff. Everybody trickling down into the middle class wants it. And then, of course, the lower class wants it. So things trickle in layers. Even if we right now are online and everyone is plugged into the same kind of, energy and information, more or less, there are still waves and waves and waves of trends, right? By the time something becomes popular, Now think of a time where none of that was possible. And the way that things were done were even slower when there was just cars, even slower than that. And you have to, slow it down and realize that things were it took decades for something to travel into a trend. All right. This is an important concept. The next concept that I want you to keep in mind is that when something is happening at a certain level in society, there are also things happening underneath. So think of the music scene, think of the fashion scene, think of the art scene, for example. Things that are happening that are super trendy. Well, what about the underground? How many things begin in the underground? Lots of things. In fact, some of the coolest things in history began in the underground. And that's when a very small community of people is doing something interesting. And by the time somebody, it catches on, it's popular and then it explodes. Now something can go viral, but there's still an underground, and things that go viral, to be honest, are, quick, funny things that society chews up and spits out. Things that have meaning start in the underground, and even to this modern quick day, it still has its speed. So the reason I explain that is because I'm going to go into a timeline in history that's extremely complicated, okay? And I'm going to be leaving out thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of things. It's impossible. This is not a history class. This is just a little bit of history on tarot. Actually, it's like the whole history of tarot, but like in just little bullet points to keep it nice and, digestible bits of information, not overwhelming. But you will walk away with the timeline, all right? Now, you can break that down, and it's not necessary to go so in depth. Later on, when I create a study group, maybe by the time you're watching this, the study group already exists, where we can discuss all kinds of neat things, all kinds of things that are brought up in lessons and homework and drill sessions and all kinds of practice sessions and everything. But right now for the course, I'm sticking to what's only important for you to know, for you to get that foundation. When we already know, we stopped the timeline when paper was invented. We're going to stop right there. I want you to understand that in a certain time period that we're going to talk about, the gypsies, which that's a slur, we are called Rom or Romani, they left India and went all the way up through Europe. Actually, they went through the Middle East, and then they kept traveling and nomadically settled in many, 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 many European countries. And then they, it took decades and decades and decades of the Romani to integrate into European life. So there are Hungarian gypsies, there are Russian gypsies, there are Spaniard gypsies, there are Italian gypsies, and so on and so forth, right? And they all took on things from the culture, and also the culture there took things from the Romani as well. And we're not getting into that subject. Maybe it would be a great sidebar later on in one of the, in the group. Because, we could talk about deeper history, beautiful, beautiful things that I want to share. But right now we have to stick to the lesson. All right. I mentioned that because if there's questions and stuff that you're curious about, we can always get into that later. Now, when the gypsies went through up India and through the Middle East and into Europe, while they were going through the Middle East, they picked up something that was going on at that time. And that was a certain card game. And I'm just going to leave it at the fact that there were a lot of games going on at the time. And the development of card games was going on. And street divination was something that, they did a lot of different things. And I don't want to get into the discussion of they're all fortune tellers or they were this or they were that, because that's not fair. There is a rich history to these people, to this diaspora. that is incredibly important, and it requires delicate and beautiful, its own space and its own explanation. But right now we're really looking at divination. We're looking at cartomancy. We're looking at fortune telling, and we're looking at tarot. So that's what I'm going to focus on, right? That's what I'm plucking from that. But obviously there's a beautiful, rich culture, and actually many cultures, but I'm just focusing on that. And that's what has my highlighted attention right now, is that. So that's what I'm going to be discussing, okay? But there's more to this. There's more to the things I'm saying. So they come in and they start integrating through society, and they brought with them certain things. And, they were all, not all, but a grand majority, at least some in each of the groups, what would fortune tell, some kind of palmistry or some kind of divination. And maybe it was tea leaf reading, whatever. Maybe it was a bunch of stuff. And through all of that, they would keep doing stuff, to make a living, right? And this is normal, you'd see peddlers on the street, and you'd see people bartering, and, I'll give you 3, chickens for that herb, and, I'll give you meat if you give me milk. And, that's a normal thing in society. There was always bazaars and trader markets and all kinds of things, even all the way in ancient Greece and Rome. This was always a thing all the time. Even today, you go down to the farmer's market and somebody's trying to sell their handmade soaps or honey, it's a thing, right? So, back then it was the same in that aspect. And a lot of street magic was going on, and it was entertainment, and it was a place with, bonfires, food and, everything like that. And every time there was some kind of entertainment, nightlife or whatever, this was a service, and people were drawn to it. Oh, how interesting. They told me something about myself. Everybody always wants to know a little bit about themselves, right? Like my grandmother used to say, a fortune teller or a diviner will never go hungry, because people will always want to know about themselves and the future. So it's very important. Obviously, it helps if you're legitimate. But unfortunately, this industry draws in so many fakes. It's crazy. Actually, that has its fun history too. And I'd love to get into that maybe on a casual note, not the course, but that would be something fun to talk about. There's a lot of interesting trivia with that. Okay, so they started, they continued to do street magic, and, sometimes they wouldn't have a lot of money, and they would pick up 3 cards from here, and they'd pick up this from here. And, they kept trinkets and all kinds of things. And a lot of them had their own types of decks and their own things. And, they would use all these things, just like charms and crystals, and, there's a lot of history there. So, remember, I read over 65 forms of divination, and, there's a whole story with, in Ireland, in Britain, in the UK, in England, different forms of divination and different things that were cast and all of that. I'm a lithomancer also. So, that all has its rich history, and in a way, in some kind of way, it interweaves, and then it doesn't, and all of that. But going back to the cards, the street divination, also called street magic, but now street magic is a different word. A different definition, but we'll call it like street divination, or street reading, street fortune telling. It was always going on, and it never stopped, but it would happen in small little groups. And little by little by little, while this was going on, 1 or 2 rich people were walking by, and they were drawn to it. And then they gossiped to their little friends, and then those little friends said, ooh, let me try it. And this slowly is building in the underground. Slowly. It's happening so slow and so small that you're barely gonna really see it dent in the story that I'm gonna tell you when I'm going through the tarot timeline. But understand that this is happening until a big boom happens. And we're going to get into that. And it goes all the way to the time where the Ouija board was invented. And we're going to get to that. We're going to get past that too. But right now, you have to understand this is going on in society. And now we're going to pay attention to the big popular stuff. We're going to pay attention to what's happening with the aristocrats and, the bourgeoisie and all of the fancy high life, right? The rich. And this is what we're going to look at: sophisticated rich families and those, circles. And besides all of this, we're going to look at a lot of the political things that were happening in the times, like gambling, a lot of things that governments were banning on gambling with playing cards, and not to mention the development of card games in general was also developing too around all of this time, and a bunch of other interesting things with art and stuff. But those are so many different timelines, but it was all happening at the same time. And it shouldn't be confusing. Look at today, you'll have a fashion line go up, and then you'll have like furniture trends, and then you'll have food trends, and then you'll have, things with, architecture, spinning off, and, electronics and computers, and, there's always something trendy going on that, always. Life is complicated, and tastes and social circles and everything like that. So I'm just saying, it shouldn't be so complicated, because just look at society today. Look how things travel. By the time it becomes a magazine article, it came from the underground first, and things like that. So if you think about it like that, I don't think it'll be too confusing, So now that you understand that all these complicated things are slowly building throughout different countries, throughout different societies, throughout different class systems, caste systems, you'll understand the hierarchy of all of that, and you'll understand, how everything is integrating slowly, okay? And of course, the fact that travel was slower, the development of cars from carriages and horses, and, all of these things impact it as well, all right? So now we're gonna go back to the timeline where we left off. Tarot really was influenced and began by the gypsies, by the Romani. We don't say gypsies because that's, a slur, even though it's a beautiful name to some, and some it's a painful word. It depends. It has its own history, but North Americans use it like, like it's a pretty thing, like a trendy boho thing. But in reality, all over the world, it's got, it's considered a slur, and there's a whole reason why. And like I said, we can get into interesting sidebars later. Now, but they were the first to influence tarot, but they're not credited, and that's very ugly. But we're gonna stick to historically. That wasn't documented though, not really. Things that were documented is what historians will go by, even though anthropologists will see and sociologists will see historical events in human behavior taking place at the time. It's really how, historians have to go by fact. So if something was printed, or something was commissioned, or a payment was made, or a receipt, or something, this is what translates into documentation. Things that are not documented is like kind of hearsay, So it's not here nor there, and but that doesn't mean it didn't exist. And that's where anthropologists and sociologists come in and fill in the gaps, and historians stick to this structure. Okay, so yes, it was really the gypsies that influenced tarot, that really, in a way, brought tarot, but they were not really the creators of tarot. They started cardomancy, the reading, fortune telling of cards. However, there's something, interesting about ancient Egypt, and that as well. There were some divinatory things on papyrus, but it really wasn't cards. So it really wasn't ancient Egypt, but ancient Egypt does have a hand in some, of course, everything. We can pretty much go back in ancient Egypt, like everything started there. It was such a sacred, beautiful, time, But anyway, it was really the gypsies that began cardomancy, but they did not invent tarot. Okay, but they led to the divination of tarot, is what is really what the gypsies did, and they're not credited for it. And you're going to have a bunch of people saying, whatever. Do your research properly, or just take my word for it. This is a fact. Now, what we can know as formal fact are what historians can document. And this, of course, is going to make sense, when I continue the timeline. So let's now start back. Left off where in 1215, Italy had their first paper mills, and that was a huge thing. We're going to go a bit after into the 1300s, and Trionfi was a very popular game going on at the time. And that's important because Trionfi, the game, is what really, that kind of like, that is really what fueled the idea for Tarocchi, which was the game where tarot came from. So interesting fact, every single form of cartomancy started as a game. Every single kind started as a game. And the history of tarot is that it was a game, a parlor game, much like poker, much like bridge. All right. But anyway, Trionfi it was a totally different game in Italy, but it was so popular and so loved that because of that foundation, it led to the development of another game called Tarocchi. And it's really Tarocchi that led to the development of tarot. Now, 1800s, when Trionfi was super peak in its popularity. Around this time, block printing was being, was progressing in Germany. Okay. Printing, artwork, you're going to hear me reference, this is why I gave you that explanation. I interrupted the timeline to give you like a nutshell, like explanation of things, because I'm going to be referencing politics. I'm going to be referencing, certain games that were being popularized, and, also like important developments in art and paints and techniques, and also certain games that were being played and things like that, because and also printing, because printing is what led to decks. If there's no paper mills and no paper and no printing press and no artwork, you get no decks, right? So it's all interwoven. So I will be referencing those small things. They're not small, but like those little sidebars and in this timeline, because I'm trying to speed it up as much as I can. This is a monster topic which to cover it would take, probably 5 days a week for 3 years. That's how much content is in this subject. So I'm just trying to do the best I can in a short window. Around the time that block printing was being developed in Germany, a game called Mamluk which means slave. It means the stolen people, the owned one in Arabic. Mamluk is a card game, and this was going on hugely in the Middle East. And remember when I told you that the Romani traveled through India all the way up into the Middle East and then into Europe and settled? Okay, so that was significant. They picked up Mamluk. It was a card game that began, it's the foundation as the visuals go for the tarot game. So there was a game called Tarocchi, which was inspired by Trionfi, but the actual layout of the cards came from Mamluk, which was Arabic, and the gypsies brought it. And also, Arab influence as well, as well. So yeah, it's a mixture of things. Now the Europeans took the Mamluk, deck, and they developed it further. and they added conversions and things like that. Now, one important thing that I'm going to mention right now that I'm not going to keep mentioning throughout this timeline, but it's really important, is that as the games and the decks started being printed and popularized, and different countries started to, do their versions throughout the years and years and decades and decades and decades and hundreds of years and all of that, the development of the decks started changing. The pips and the trump cards, bringing in the development of the major arcana and, the minor arcana, and a lot of things were being added. One deck had this thing, one deck had another one deck didn't have this, one deck had that. And we're going to go over some of that, but understand that the deck wasn't exactly, the deck you hold today in your hand was not identical to what it was. Oh, no. That's not, lots of changes and things, but I can't go over everything. I just wanted to tell you that that's also happening throughout all of this process. So it's really around the 1300s that activity began, where, the street divination and the Mamluk, being, popularized, and then the other games going on were becoming popular. And then of course around the 1300s, there was a whole big thing in different countries where there was politics against gambling, and then some areas were just favoring the rich and allowing some games as long as it was chess and tarot and things, because tarot was being played already, not called tarot, but it was taroki. And, they were allowing all these things. And then in some areas they weren't. And then you had to be wealthy to play, which then, here we go, the gypsies, when those that were, street divining, if they were able to get decks sometimes, and then they were in pieces of the decks, and sometimes part of it was meshed with playing cards, part of it was old Mamluk, part of it, they would use their own deck, and sometimes they would actually get decks. And it got to the point where decks were affordable. And then they were using it as well on the street. And this was really significant and really important. Again, not everything there was documented in a formal historical sense. So it would be outside of a historically, favored timeline. It would be more in the anthropological, journals and recorded things that way, because of that, not documented formal. The important thing to understand is that games of all kinds were becoming even more popular. Humans have always loved comedy. They've loved music and arts and performing arts, and humans have always loved games, right? So in every era of time, there's going to be shows, performances, dances, things to be entertained, hangouts, ways to drink wine or whatever it was, and some kind of thing to hang out and have food and drink and unwind, and also games. It's part of human nature, no matter what. So games are a big thing, especially at a time where there was no internet, not even cars. So it's a thing. And, you have to understand that, that this was a form of major entertainment. So, and of course, humans have always been connected to the spiritual too. So there's always going to be something going on underground, and we're going to get to big eras in that in a minute. But anyway, but you have to envision that at this time, these games were exploding with popularity, and we're talking about actual playing cards. So poker, backgammon, bridge, all those things, actual playing decks, we're leaving those out, but that's also layer it on top with everything going on, in this development. So Nipe was the name of a referenced printed material on tarot cards. And the first time that it ever popped up was in Spain. So it was Spain that produced the first official printed reference of tarot, called Nipe. It wasn't tarot, it was playing cards, So I just want to be clear. I said tarot, but I meant playing cards. So the first reference to playing cards of what they meant and, you know, what each one represented for playing the game was naipe, and that was in Spain. And that was just for playing a game of, you know, whatever playing deck, whatever they were playing at the time. So let's just say, for example, poker. I'm just using that as an example. There was a whole history on games, but let's just say it was for that kind of playing, not divination, and not the tarot deck. The tarot deck is coming. So let's continue. Now we leave the 1300s and we go into the 1400s. And in the 1400s, this is where the game tarocchi started to be played, the game developed, and the game started to be very, very popular. Not like Triomfi, which was the old one, you know, out with the old, in with the new. Tarocchi was like finally so developed, it took so long, and finally it was just, you know, at its peak of popularity, and it was growing. And other games too, but this was very, very important. We're in the 15th century, and this was you know, I guess you could kind of compare tarocchi with bridge. This was where the gambling politics got really strong, and you had a lot of, you know, laws and rules and regulations, you know, based on that, that governments were honing down more and more and more. Gambling was really, you know, out of control, and they had to do something and intervene. And, you know, church and state, lots of different things going on there. And you know, they did favor the wealthy and all of that. And tarocchi seemed like a game that was all right, you know, to play. So a wealthy family in Italy, they're not the only ones. There's a whole history on the families and what happened and all this. I'm leaving that out, but we'll just say, and some of them had, you know, royal blood, but we're leaving all of that out. Basically, in the 1440s, an artist, you know, named Bonifacio Bembo, he was commissioned by a wealthy family to paint and illustrate a custom tarocchi deck. This is very important. He ended up being commissioned several times, and he illustrated in his lifetime around 3 decks, and you know, one of them became the most popular, and I'm going to show you one of those as a reprint. The first deck ever of tarot. So if someone says to you, what was the first tarot deck? Very easy. It's Visconti. And this is a reprint from Lo Scarabo. This is Visconti. Right? And the back looks like this. And the cards, some are upside down, but look like that. So we'll pull a, let's pull, so this is the coins. Very, very beautiful. And of course, you know, me being a professional artist and everything and painter, I want to get into the history of, you know, the artwork at the time, but I'm not. I'm going to spare you all that stuff, but maybe that's something we can discuss at another time. You know, of course, the paints, the history, the artwork, and all of that is very important. And, you know, I have so much to say from a historical perspective on the art of tarot, but I'm only going to touch on very minimal, and I'm not going to, you know, bother you with that. Okay. But anyway, so this is, this right here is the Judgment card. And let's show you a few more. So this one would be the Wheel of Fortune. And we'll finish off with, I want to do a major. So this one would be the Tower. It's like a castle tower. Okay. So just to give you an idea, so this deck is called Visconti, and it is a reprint of the first, you know, of the first tarot deck ever created. And was there any other deck created before this one? Yes. Technically, yes. But that's a whole other thing. It wasn't as significant as the Visconti. The Visconti is officially the first tarot deck ever created. And, it's a gorgeous, representation of Renaissance art of the time, which artistically in history, oh my gosh, so much to say about that. But let us continue. So the second Bembo deck was the most popular because the Visconti deck was not as popular as the Visconti Sforza. Those are two different last names, but it's hyphenated. Visconti Sforza. That one I don't have a deck of. Maybe I do. I just don't know where it is. But it has like a red on the cover and you can get it online and stuff. It's also absolutely gorgeous. And we're not getting into the differences and the major arcana differences and all that, because right now I could go back and do a timeline just on how the devil card has changed. Like that in itself would be just a class. That's how deep that we can go, but we're not. Okay, but just to give you an idea, like the trump cards, the pips and all of that, I already said that went through its own history. It changed. This deck started with this one. These people added this and blah, 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 like that. All right. So there's a whole big complexity. But anyway, the official first deck tarot ever made is Visconti. That's different than Visconti Sforza. That was the second. So we're not getting into like why and, what the wedding and the whole thing that happened with the family and the commission and why it was, why they paid Bembo, the artist, and all that. That has its whole history. Not important, really. Let's go on to the other deck. So the most important was Visconti, second Visconti Sforza, which has the red cover, which I can't find. I know it's somewhere. And then one I don't own is Brambilla. That was Bembo's third deck, and it's not that popular. I don't, it's been a while since, have I ever seen a Brambilla deck for sale? I don't remember. I don't think they have any. I don't think it was as popular. Some people might use the word Brambilla, but it's not official. You'd have to look at, museums and stuff and, make sure it's the proper reprint, and you can do something like that. Look, if you want something, I've never bothered because it just doesn't, I'm happy with the Visconti is what I like. And the Visconti Sforza, but I don't use it as much as the Visconti. Although that's not the deck that I read. That's not my favorite deck by any means. But it's cool to own. And I love giving readings with it, but yeah, let's move on. Now, after this, the Bembo's decks were done and stuff. A little while later, in another part of Italy, in Bologna, there was the Bolognese, the Tarot Bolognese deck. And that, I don't have a copy of that. I don't have a reprint of the Bolognese deck. It doesn't interest me. It's really pretty, and I should have it in my little archive, but it's cool. I might buy one in the future, just add it, if I'm in the mood, but it's not like one of those, I have to have it. But it's very beautiful. It really is. And if you want to have it and you're a tarot collector like me, then, maybe it might be super cool. I'm into collecting something else, and I'll get into that later. All right, so let's continue after the Bolognese deck. So remember that up to now, all of the tarot decks that were being, painted were the originals. And, there was some printing going on, but small scale, and it was something for these rich families to play the parlor games. And we're talking about originals being painted. Can you imagine? And it's not exactly like you can take these cards and put them through lamination, okay? There were no laminating machines back then, so you can imagine. So now let's go, and another thing too, remember that around this time, it was for games, like poker games, not poker, but like games like that, right? So gambling games, let's just call it gambling games. That's really what it was. So it wasn't used for divination. So none of these decks were for that. Like these were games. These were part of the games. Now, something interesting is about to happen. So in now we're leaving the 1400s, we're into the 1500s now. So hi Feruza. So in 1575, in Venice, first tarot deck was printed, and this is mass printed for sale. Now, I want to say something very important here. This is a sidebar from the timeline, not to confuse you, but to help. I want you to understand that, throughout history, but especially in this time, but honestly always, Italy has always been the mecca of what's beautiful and what's trendy and what's, luxurious. It's always been Italy, always. And the French have always copied the Italians. If you look in history, you will see even what inspired Versailles and everything like that was Italy, absolutely. And Italy has always been looked up at, whatever they're doing, it's the fanciest and it's the most beautiful and oh my God, and all of that with art, with everything. And the cards were no different. So in Paris, 1600s, there was a deck that was produced and printed called Vieilleville, version of Tarocchi. So let's go into this sidebar a little bit more. You have Italy being the first one, the pioneer in producing all this cool stuff with games. If anything was cool somewhere else, Italy would make it explode with popularity and fame. Anything, gambling games, and it's gonna even be, the fortune telling and all of that. It was really Italy. So you have Italy doing all the cool stuff, and then France saying, we want cool stuff too. And then Germany saying, excuse me, so do we. We want our own version. And then all the other countries like Belgium and, all the other countries started to do their own thing. And Sicily, which obviously is part of Italy, but Sicily kind of has its own unique style. And, in Sicily, they were developing their own stuff differently. And it goes on and on. So now imagine I'm trying to do the history of tarot while I'm referencing the history of cartomancy and playing cards too. And now we get to see that all the other countries started to do their own versions of stuff, and then it spun off from there. So can you imagine how complicated this gets? Just keep that in mind. Let's go back to the timeline. Now we go into 1660. John Noble, that's not how you pronounce it, but we'll just Americanize it right now, produced the first TDM. Can you imagine? Oh my God, how cool. TDM deck was produced at that time. Very exciting. Let's move on. Go right into the 18th century. We're gonna go right into the 1700s. This is the first tarot reader. This is when it starts getting juicy. This is when all that cartomancy stuff is really gonna start. Now, was it happening in the streets, like I said before, and all of that in the underground? Hell yeah, it was. But, this is when something really cool is just about to start happening. Jean-Baptiste Alliet, he was the first tarot reader that got the credit for it. He wasn't the first tarot reader. He wasn't the first cartomancer. Hell no. But he was the first in history. So he's the first that was documented to be the first tarot reader, right? And he created a deck called Eteia, Atilia, whatever way you want to pronounce it, Atilia, whatever. So that it's Eteia, and that's how he, that was his deck. And we're going to get into that a little bit further. So this would be the first tarot reader who later created his own deck, and his inspiration was ancient Egypt, a lot of things from ancient Egypt, and he learned it from a man called Piedmont. That was his last name. So that's interesting. That was his mentor. So in 1760, we get to the very, very favorite time of mine for my favorite deck. 1760 was the first, even though there was, I already mentioned a highlight in the timeline before for TDM. This was the first TDM. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is the standard, by the time TDM developed, this was the standard of the TDM deck that was, established and printed. So 1760 is when TDM became standard and established. Up until then, it was going through changes and stuff like that, which of course, after that, it went through tons of changes. So for those that know, TDM is my favorite tarot system. We're gonna know more about that in my other class, which is on the tarot systems. I'm gonna take you through all of them. I'm gonna show you what they're about, how they're used, and all of that. So it's really called Grimou, but some people say Grimond. All right, and the other one is Fournier. All right, so these are the two famous printing presses, and that's significant because these are the ones that are going to distribute it, print all these tarot decks and distribute it throughout Europe, and then other countries are going to start developing their own, and they're going to go through histories, and they're going to go through, and then other cartomancy systems are going to spin out, and all this cool stuff. All right, so that is very important. Now we get to the funnest part of this timeline. The 1890s. This is when the Ouija board was invented. And around this time, there was this huge revolution of spirituality everywhere. Especially after the war, a lot of people wanted to connect with loved ones. And that's where seances started. Big time everywhere, the whole crystal ball thing, readings, even though crystals have their own history. I do crystal ball. I'm a crystal ball reader, and lithomancer and all of that. But this was a time where the spiritual craze and all that was going on, and this is such a fun time in history for anyone into Bell's Books and Candles, spooky stuff, spirits, ghosts, the paranormal, palmistry, divination, tarot. This was a fun time. Everything was full of that legend and lore, and it was a lot of fun. And this is when the first Ouija board was created and started to be distributed. So now we go to 20 years later, roughly around 20 years later. And this is where the Rider-Waite deck was made. And after that, in 1970, well, of course we have to talk about, Crowley and, his deck and everything they were doing, and, which, we're going to talk about in the tarot systems, not in this one, but this is just the brief timeline. I call it the tarot timeline. This is when the Rider-Waite deck was, made, and he created it, and it has a whole story. And then, after that, Crowley made his deck, which is Thoth and all of that. And we end the timeline in 1971. Well, no, there's a little bit more after that timeline, but anyway, essentially the tarot timeline, in 1971, US Games, acquired ownership over the copyright of the Rider-Waite deck, which was monumental. It was a huge thing, because that's why now you can go on any store, any online shop that sells cards, and any big box retailer, and you will see thousands and thousands of decks for sale with artwork. Of course, now there's there's independent printing and small batch printing and all of them. I'm talking about that. Me included, because I'm developing my own deck. I'm an artist and a diviner for so many years, all of my life. So, I'm developing my own decks and books that go with the decks and, stuff like that. So, but that's printing. Printing is available. But when we're talking about, formally published decks, which I might go that route, but I don't know, but anyway, this was huge, because this meant that more illustrators and more creators of decks and deck designers and game designers and all of that can have a hand in it, and they can, recreate the writer deck, and it would be great fun, because U.S. games were allowing the reprinting. So this was amazing. This is what made tarot such a huge art form. I mean, it always was an art form, but this is what made the Oracle decks spin out and everything like that, and all the tarot decks, and all, you can make it of any character you like, and you could have a Star Wars tarot, and you can have a tarot with your favorite superheroes, different themes. And this is why, because of the copyright with U.S. games, when they were publishing the decks. Now it's different. Now as long as the person's not infringing on the copyrights, the person would need U.S. games permission if they're going to recreate the Rider-Waite deck. But there's a whole other thing with that, so we're not going to get into the whole illustrator legalities and copyright and all that. It's too much for this thing, for this timeline. I just want to stick to the fact that in 1971, this was a huge game changer because of the printing and the huge possibilities now of all kinds of designs. Now, what happened from 1971 to now? Huge timeline. We're not going to bother with that, but oh my gosh, there were in the 60s, psychedelic 60s, there was a huge awakening for crystals and healing and all kinds of mystical things, tarot as well. There was a thing in the 80s with the New Age, in the 90s with the whole Wicca craze after that, and so many things. There's just so much that we're not covering in the timeline, but with tarot itself, because tarot, the decks and the designs and all of that. What are we doing now, though? What's happening now? How are we going to end this timeline? I'll tell you. Right now, tarot is taking a spin. And by the way, let me show the Rider-Waite deck. So first, I didn't show the Jean-Baptiste deck. And we're gonna, this is very important because, so this is the back. And this deck is very unique in the way that it starts. It's not like your regular tarot. So this is a tarot system all on its own, and we're going to be talking about that, and I'm going to show you how to use it and everything like that in the tarot systems. And we're going to be going over all the tarot systems. But this, this was a reprint from Los Scarabeo also. And this would be from that first tarot reader that I told you about in history. So this is very important and quite amazing. And his inspiration was from Egypt and all of that. So that's its own thing. I'll show you the box one more time. And it would be that. There's a couple of reprints on it, and we'll talk about that. And then this one is one of them. I have many Rider-Waite decks. There are Rider-Waite deck collectors. And they're very, I'll talk about this during the system. So I'm going to have a whole section on the Rider-Waite deck itself, ways to collect it and everything. But I'm also going to have a section of that in this course that you're going to want to know about, because this concentrates itself on the how to buy a deck and how to, understand. So the weight stuff will be in this course. The other systems will be in the tarot systems. Okay, so this is just, just to show you a quick example. There are many decks. You probably have a different one. I have many different types of Rider-Waite decks, and we will talk about that later. So in finishing the timeline part, so we can end the history section, you have to understand that right now in modern day, so 2024, and in the years to come, tarot can be divided as far as the use of it, the way it's being used, in 3 categories. The first one is readers. Everybody, there's so many people that are just jumping onto the whole reader thing. And then there's mastery divination with it. And then there is the psychology. So the world of psychology decided to take the deck and say, oh, we're going to use this for self-therapy. We're going to use this, for a tool. And now there was a time in the 70s and before, 80s and before, 90s and before, 2000s and before, where if a person was a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but mainly psychologist, and they were caught with, a tarot deck, they would be made fun of, ridiculed, and called a sham in the psychology world, because one is a science and one is a pseudoscience. One is very, technical, and the other one is, and based on study and research and, logic and reasoning. And the other one is spirituality and intuition and all metaphysical things and, things like that. And it was seen as wishy-washy, so it was very criticized. But times have changed. And now the world of psychology is using it as a tool for development. But the biggest problem, okay, so let me sidebar real quick. I'm an artist, and when I paint, and I would, back when I would run just my art brand, I would be doing like paint videos and this and that, and people would watch and tell me, like they told all artists would say, people go watch me paint or watch me draw, and it was therapy for them. They would relax. And also when I would teach them how to draw and paint and they would take a workshop, their stress level would go all the way down, which is why adult coloring exploded in popularity. Now you had therapists, the type of therapist, not physical therapy for bones and ligaments and all that. I'm talking about like psychological, mental therapists were taking art and now merging art with therapy, because it is a beautiful way to give therapy. Art and therapy go hand in hand for people that are healing, but art has nothing to do with therapy. Art is art. But therapists found that people that would do art, it would unwind them and they would improve and everything like that. So what happened was that the therapists started using art, and the artists were saying, you're not an artist, you're a therapist. Like, what are you doing? We're the ones that are supposed to be hashtagging art therapy. We're painting and they're relaxing. Well, you're not a therapist. Okay, you're not an artist. So there was a big debate. Okay, now there's psychics, diviners using tarot, and psychologists using tarot. And the psychologists are saying, we're using tarot and it's the way to grow, and you're having a tower moment, and oh my god, and you're like, this is your tower moment, and like you have to like grow and like let go of stress, and oh my god. And then you have psychics going, yeah, like tarot masters, it's not what it means, like what are you doing? And then you have therapists going, well, you don't know how to self-heal and you don't know how to give therapy. Okay, yeah, we're diviners. We're telling you what the spirit world's saying. And then you have the diviners saying, okay, well, it's not self-therapy. This is like a way to communicate. Well, no, it's the way to do this and this. So what happened was, same thing with the art world. So you have, the bottom line is, do whatever makes you feel happy. Okay, you want to call aliens with it? Make your phone call. Like do whatever you want to do, okay? The thing is that at the end of the day, what the majority of humans can't have is confusion. And when you have therapeutic ideas of, let me do the other concept first. You have art, and you have artists going through art stages of making their signature artwork for the sake of art, and going through what it really represents, which artists are conduits for social change, and what they're doing, creating paracosms and magical worlds and characters. And we are visually creating what authors put in words. I'm also a writer, but a literary artist. But anyway, what I'm saying is from the visual perspective. And then you have these therapists, which they're amazing because they're healing people that really need it. And they're trying to say, well, no, it's about like just buying the paints and going through the motions psychologically. No, this is art for art. This is art. Please go away and do your own thing. Artists are going to art because you don't understand what it's like. It's a language we were born to speak. Like, please, keep your, not everybody has mental health issues. Not everybody has a situation where they need to heal. Although that's not true. Everybody benefits from crafts and building things. We're human. And in fact, that's really what started the craft craze in history. It was people overwhelmed by work and anyway, another cool history, in time. But yes, so it keeps people healthy. It's been proven, and we need it. And everybody, whether you do it for art's sake and you're not an artist, you still need to do something with your hands. I don't care if it's clay, crochet, wood, whatever, build something, do something, paint something. It relieves stress and pressure from the body. It is so needed, okay? But I get a little cynical because when like invading, two areas, and artists do the same thing. They're like, what the hell is this shit? Like what, this is not therapy. So I get the debate, but I appreciate and respect both aspects. Well, let's go back into the cartomancy part. You have the tarot and the therapist, and you know what? It was a game. It was a parlor game. It has every right to be a tool for therapy. Why the hell not? It's true. It has. But tarot itself, by the time the major and minor arcana developed even more, and the meanings and everything, and the way it was revolutionized, well, especially the weight. But, this was for the occult. This was for talking to spirits. And this is for the spirituality. This is for things that go bump in the night. And it has nothing to do with mental healing. So all I'm saying is, while I respect both, to give you both examples, you understand how what I can't have happen is students get confused. If you're learning cards for self-therapy, take it to that level, and that's what you're doing. That's a whole other ballgame, because that has nothing to do with, reading, divination, nothing at all. Absolutely nothing. And then there's, if you're doing it to be a reader, and then if you have the abilities, if you're clairvoyant, then you want to take it to the divination level, whatever, right? That's different. So I'm saying, no matter what, do what you do what you're going to do what makes you happy, but understand the difference. This is why a foundation is important. So you're not shooting in the dark, and you're not, deer caught in the headlights when you're looking at something and go, oh, I don't know what that is. I'm so confused. Oh my God, I don't know which way to turn. Okay, this course, yes, you do. I'm going to show you what that's all about. Understand that difference, all right? That being said, this is the end of the timeline. Where is the future of tarot headed? I think it's going to be, I think that the future of it is the digital art and the eventually AI versions and more games. Even though, if we go back, the first video game, I used to love this game. I think it was for the NES, or was it the Sega Genesis? I don't remember, but I was a very little kid. But I used to play Taboo. And it was for tarot. Oh my God, I used to love that game so much. It was so cool. So it was called Taboo. And Of course, it didn't really work like, divination, but it was cool. Just like apps. Apps today are so cool, but it's not, maybe that's something we can discuss in the club and stuff, the sidebar, after the class or whatever. It would be great to talk about, because I have my own things to say about, something that I read about in Turkey going on, and Turkish culture, and, a lot of things I want to say about that. But where I think it's headed is, a lot of AI, a lot of digital, readings, and the artwork as well. But I also think it's going to be bigger than ever in actual card form, and the fortune telling world is going to explode. Okay, that word is seen as something ugly today, but it's not. It's really, you're telling a person's fortune, and fortune would be the things coming, good and bad. So it got a bad stigma, but it's a beautiful word to me. I have a Ray Dunn mug that says fortune teller and one that says psychic, and I love the word fortune teller. I own that word. I love that word. Own it, walk the talk, and I love that. I love what I do. I have no problem with that word. Other people are like, oh my God, you're not a fortune teller. You're this, you're this. It's all the labels now. I don't care. I think it's a freaking awesome, gorgeous, cute term. And every time I see a t-shirt with it or something, or a sticker, I get it. So I love it. And all I'm trying to say is, taking things, I think the tarot world is going to really, explode with even more decks, more art, and also go into the digital space as well. But the digital space, already it's showing that it's driving people crazy. They don't like it, they don't trust it. It seems really cool, and they're all let down because it's a freaking machine. It's not a human contacting spirits. But we'll talk about how I feel the spiritual world can interweave with technology in another, maybe a sidebar later, because that's also a very sci-fi kind of cool thing I want to get into. Especially my art brain goes off with all kinds of little circuits, when I think about that. But yes, can a spell be held in the internet? And anyway, we'll get into that another time. That's not the course. But as you can see, this is where I think it's headed. I think it's going to be even bigger, and I think there's going to be greater ways to make money. And also, one important thing I want to talk about is I love empowering women. Yes, I love everybody, men and women and everything. But I'm just saying, like humans, although I'll tell you, I'm more partial to loving animals. It's like I have a softer spot for animals. Humans are like, "Arr." I don't know, I'm too moody and too antisocial sometimes. But no, but in a general sense, though, I love humankind. And, even though I'm antisocial and I'm like a sea urchin, but, I love humans, and I've always, loved human rights, and I've always been an advocate for, certain things for human rights and everything. But what I'm saying is, I love in general empowering women. I think women in general around the world, if they were to use fortune telling to make money and to grow and feed their children, or feed, maybe sometimes it's just them and their husband, or themselves for self-worth, self-value. I think it's beautiful. I think it's absolutely beautiful. And if I can contribute to empowering women that way and teaching this, it's a beautiful thing. And I have lots more lessons to come, and hopefully you like my teaching style. All right, guys, so we're going to end this section, which is on history, and we're going to pick up on the next part.